We're here to bring a new type of news show.
New insights, new style, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Bringing news just for you. It's Monday, December 29th here in Seoul. I'm Isujin, and this is News Generation. Joining us today is Haeyoung.
Happy Monday, everyone.
Happy Monday, and also Christopher's with us.
Hi, great to be with you.
And both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. So it's Monday, the start of a brand new work week, but this week is a little different. It's the final week of 2025. And as the year comes to a close, we're reflecting on key areas of our society and how they've impacted the lives of young people over the past year. And today we begin with none other than the economy. So in Korea, the end of the year is also tax season, a time to settle accounts and reflect on income and spending. So as 2025 comes to a close, how did the economy impact young people this year?
Well, first of all, I'm a freelancer, so I don't actually start working on year-end tax settlement as I wrap up a year. I do it in May instead. But even without that formal process, around this time every year, I naturally reflect on how I did financially compared to last year. And I think about how much my income grew, whether I managed my spending more wisely, and how much I was able to save. And people often say these days, oh, everything goes up except my salaries. But I was fortunate to work more this year, and that did translate into higher earnings, and I'm grateful for that. But at the same time, living cost rose significantly and prices went up, and as my child started more after-school activities, expenses increased as well. So to be honest, even though I earned more a little bit, my savings didn't grow as much as I had hoped, and I think that really reflects how many young people these days felt about the economy this year, working harder, earning a bit more, but still feeling financial pressure because costs keep rising faster and faster.
And at the same time, I feel like as you get older, there's so many places where you can spend your money on.
Right.
So that's true. So what about you? Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a really important point about the rising costs that young people are facing. I wanted to highlight a bit of a different angle here. So I noticed that for many people in my age group, one of the biggest challenges in 2025 has been the so-called labor market duality. So on paper, we have these statistics to say, youth unemployment is pretty low. We have, the economy grew this year, but there are increasing numbers of young people who are in this category called resting. So they're not looking for work, they're not working, so they've kind of like given up on finding a job. So in the last 20 years, the number of people who are in their 20s in Korea has actually decreased by 17%, but the number of resting people in their 20s has grown by over 60%. So that indicates that the share of people who have given up on finding a job has increased significantly. So from what I see, I don't think it's necessarily that people don't want to work. It's that people are getting more selective and kind of giving up on that process if they can't get that ideal job that they were kind of seeking. So that's one trend that I've kind of observed. I do think that AI is a big thing here. So with a lot of these like entry-level kind of positions, internship kind of things being automated away, those kind of opportunities to have your foot in the door, those opportunities are somewhat decreasing or disappearing. So I think that those AI-induced hurdles are a big thing that young people face and will continue to face in the coming years. So we should keep an eye on that.
So I think what you're describing suggests a disconnect between headline employment numbers and the reality young people face on the ground. So we're going to talk more about this, but first let's take a look at the screen. As the year comes to an end, many people are taking a closer look at their finances, reviewing their spending as they file their year-end taxes. For many young people, that reflection hasn't been easy this year. Rising prices and housing costs have put growing pressure on their wallets. And as financial anxiety has increased, so has interest in different forms of investment among young people here in Korea. Today on News Generation, we examine the financial realities that young people faced in 2025 in Korea and around the world, from changing investment habits to widening wealth gaps. So as we just saw in a video, for many young people, simply saving money has become harder than ever with rising living costs and housing prices. In fact, recent data shows a growing gap between younger households and the overall population, a sign that asset polarization is deepening. So Seyoung, what do the latest figures tell us about young people's financial situation right here in Korea?
Let's all take a look at the screen first. According to the Korean Statistical Information Service, or KOSIS, the average monthly surplus for household has under the age of 39 fell by about 2.7% in the third quarter of this year compared to the same period last year. And what's striking is the contrast. During the same period, the average surplus for all households actually increased by more than 12%. Here, surplus refers to the amount of money left after subtracting living expenses from household income. So when that surplus shrinks, it means young households have less room to save, invest, or prepare for the future. And at the same time, housing affordability continues to worsen as well. The price-to-income ratio, which compares home prices to annual income, has kept rising, making it increasingly difficult for young people to build assets through home ownership, which has long been one of the most common paths to wealth accumulation here in Korea. So taken all together, while the overall economy may appear to be improving on paper, many young people are finding it harder to accumulate wealth.
So what's striking here is the contrast. So while overall household surpluses are rising, younger households are falling behind. So that raises an important question. So is this widening gap unique to Korea, or are young people elsewhere facing similar pressure? So is this gap between rich and the poor something we're also seeing in the US?
Yeah, so I think this gap is similar in some respects and different in other respects. So the one similarity is in both cases we see a K-shaped divergence. So if you just imagine the letter K, the haves are seeing an upward trajectory while the have-nots are kind of sliding downward. So in the US, this dynamic manifests in terms of like consumption power. So because the US is a consumption-led economy, it is a major concern that the top 10% of earners account for over half of all private spending, and apparently 20% of the top earners account for 2/3 of all private spending. So for young Americans, I think the price of participation, or the cost to enter middle-class life, is increasing. Or it's skyrocketed by many accounts. And I think home ownership is another aspect of this. So back in the 1990s, the average age of first home ownership would have been 28 years old. Now it's 40.
Wow.
So it shows how the prices have risen in that respect. I do think in Korea the situation is different though. So on paper, income inequality is actually less severe than in America, but there is this net asset gap that's at an all-time high. So the top 20% holds nearly 45%. The top 20% holds nearly 45 times the asset wealth of the bottom 20%. And so that's almost entirely driven by the surge in prices of housing in Seoul. And there was one interesting statistic that said that if the average salary worker were to save every penny that they earn, it would take them 29 years in order to be able to afford a house in Seoul. So that just shows how unaffordable things are. And it's not surprising that many young people feel that this is a futile situation. And if they can't, no matter how hard they work, they can't achieve that same level of security or that same lifestyle that their parents had, then opting out of the process entirely might be an option for them, at least the way they perceive it. So that's a significant issue.
So I can see how both in Korea and the US, we're seeing the same bigger pattern: rising prices, shrinking purchasing power, and the growing anxiety about the future, especially with the skyrocketing housing prices. And in that environment, owning assets seems to matter more than ever. So with assets becoming increasingly important, how are millennials and Gen Zs changing the way or what they kind of invest in these days?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, for many people in their parents' or grandparents' generation, real estate was a key way to build wealth here in Korea, and home ownership became a symbol of financial stability. But that mindset still exists, but the environment has changed. With fewer 전세 listing here, 전세 is Korea's unique lump sum rental system, and more people pushed into monthly rent. Many young people worry that both housing costs and home prices will just keep rising if they wait. And as a result, we're seeing an increase in first-time home buyers, especially among millennials and Gen Z, even under tighter lending rules. And looking at this year's transaction data, apartments account for nearly 80% of all home sales, and this preference is particularly strong among younger buyers, partly due to growing distrust of villas collapse after 전세 fraud cases. And in fact, people in their 30s now make up the largest group of apartment buyers, showing that for many young investors, securing housing has become the primary focus of asset building.
So kind of what stands out the most here these days in this market is like the anxiety that so many people have about, this
now or never.
Right, the fear of falling behind, because you see people around you that are able to buy these apartments that are priced at these crazy numbers.
Right.
So this could be one thing that's more also evident among the younger generations. So speaking of which, so when it comes to financial investments, especially stocks, so how are millennials and Gen Zs different from the way older generations kind of used to invest?
Yeah, I think in the US case, younger generations kind of perceived investing as this boring chore that the older generations did to marginally improve their situation over the course of decades. But I do think in recent years, both in Korea and in the US, the MZ generation has kind of grown to appreciate the power of investing for growing wealth. And I think post-COVID, we saw like meme coins, meme stocks, and kind of, if I throw my money in here, I might, make it big. And that kind of perception has definitely changed. I think, some statistics suggest that US Gen Zers start at an average age of 21. That's when they start investing. Apparently that's used to be 35 was the age that the boomer generation started investing. So that interest is definitely there. I think interest in investing is definitely good in general, but I do think that there is a tendency to gravitate towards these highly volatile assets like cryptocurrency or these meme stocks like GameStop or something like that. So I do think that that's a risk to get kind of hooked into that. There was a research from University of Chicago which suggested that people who have low prospects for finding a house or being able to afford a house, those people tend to gravitate towards those volatile stocks. So that's obviously a worrisome trend. On the other hand, I think some people are overly cautious and they might, put all their money in savings. And of course, there's risk with that as a financial decision, given that inflation would be chipping away at your savings. So I think there's probably a healthy middle ground somewhere with ETFs or index funds. But I do think that this kind of get-rich-quick gambling that some young people have fallen into, not everyone, of course, but there is a trend towards that I've observed. So I think that's a symptom of the broader economic woes that some young people are facing, especially amid the asset kind of disparity here.
Right. I guess they feel that because they don't see any other option. They don't only see any other way to buy these, expensive houses.
Right.
So what's striking is that investing has shifted from long-term planning to a response to pressure, and in many cases, the fear of being left behind. So it sounds like investing is no longer just about building wealth, but about trying to bypass a system that feels increasingly out of reach. So we want to know about your investment style in this economic environment as well. So we asked on the Arirang News YouTube channel, what are you currently investing in the most? So here's what the results showed. The largest share of respondents, 42%, said they focus on savings or time deposits, reflecting a cautious approach amid economic uncertainty. The stocks came next at 23%, followed by real estate at 19%. Meanwhile, 11% reported investing in other assets, highlighting a smaller but notable interest in alternative options. So despite the hype around investing, the numbers show a clear preference for low-risk options in an uncertain economy. It really shows how cautious many young people are feeling right now, especially with so much financial uncertainty. So to get an expert's take on this, we're going to talk to a business professor, and that conversation will take place right after the break, so don't go anywhere.
NewsGen wants to hear from you. Go to YouTube and search out channel Arirang News. Click Posts and cast your vote in the poll. Make a new type of news with us.
Joining us today is Professor Pang Min-jung, a business professor at Kumo National Institute of Technology. So hello, thank you so much for connecting with us today.
Hello, thank you for having me today.
So is wealth polarization that we talked about throughout the show among young people a global trend and not just happening in Korea?
Yes, these days, wealth polarization among young people is clearly a global trend, not a phenomenon limited to one country. Similar patterns are observed across advanced economies such as the United States, Europe, Japan, and South Korea. One major driver is the sharp rise in housing prices, which has far outpaced income growth. As a result, young people who receive family support or already own assets are in a very different position from those who did not. So at the same time, prolonged high interest rates make it harder for young people without initial capital to use borrowing or pathway to asset accumulation. And in addition, stable middle-class jobs have declined, making early career income more uncertain. These factors together mean that wealth gaps are no longer primarily about individual effort or saving behavior, but about structural differences in starting conditions. So over time, this trend weakens social mobility and reduces the long-term dynamism of the economy.
I see. Professor Park, then how are millennials and Gen Z approaching investing differently compared to the older generations? And in your perspective, what's driving those differences?
Yeah, these days, millennials and Gen Z tend to view investing not as an option, but as a necessary for economic survival. Unlike previous generations, they recognize that traditional savings alone are unlikely to lead to home ownership or meaningful wealth accumulation. As a result, they enter financial markets earlier and are more willing to invest in equities, ETFs, and digital assets and other high-risk instruments. They also rely heavily on mobile platforms, social media, and online communities for financial information rather than traditional financial institutions. So while this behavior is sometimes labeled as speculative, from a business and economic perspective, it can be understood as a rational response to constrained opportunities. However, this shift also carries some risks. Differences in financial literacy and information quality can amplify inequality even within the same generation.
Right, I think that's a very important point about financial literacy and how that is affecting the outcomes for young people. In light of that, I wanted to ask your perspective on what policies, if any, could help give younger people a fair chance despite the growing wealth inequality in your view.
Yeah, effective policy responses should focus less on short-term income supports and more on creating structural pathways for asset building. Programs such as matches savings account for young people, tax incentives for long-term investment, and early access to diversified financial products can help reduce initial disadvantages. Equally important is institutionalized financial education that equips young people to manage risk, and make informed decisions. Without this, greater market access may simply lead to greater losses. Finally, asset building policies must be complemented by housing stability and fair labor market access. The goal is not only equal outcomes, but more equitable access to opportunities at the starting line, which ultimately supports both social cohesion and sustainable economic growth.
So I hope we do see those changes in the new year. So thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today, Professor.
Thank you.
So we've talked about how widening inequality is playing out globally, how millennials and Gen Zs are investing, what kind of policies could help level the playing field. But beyond the numbers, this growing gap is also showing up in everyday language and culture. So how is economic polarization shaping the way young people talk about money and even about themselves, Hyo?
Well, as the economic slowdown drags on, young people are constantly exposed to news about soaring housing prices. And at the same time, young celebrities buying buildings worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And that contrast has made feelings of relative deprivation much more visible. And what's different today is that instead of keeping just those feelings inside, many young people turn them into humor. New expressions like poverty pain, which is 거지통 in Korean, or commoner pain, or 서민통, have become part of everyday language, a way to laugh through frustration. But honestly, as someone in my 30s, I do feel a bit conflicted about that trend. These words are playful on the surface, but underneath they reflect a sense of distance from certain lifestyles lifestyles from certain futures. And that shift in language tells us a lot about how deeply economic polarization is shaping not just spending habits, but how young people see themselves and feels about themselves.
I mean, it's really telling that people are turning to humor and self-mockery to cope with what is going on these days, especially when they feel constantly exposed to extreme wealth online. But here's where things get a bit interesting. So Christopher, when we look at the actual data, are young people actually more worse off than before, or is there a gap between perception and kind of reality?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a bit of a paradox here. So there is a mix. I think the data is a mixed bag. So on paper, relative poverty for young people in Korea dropped from 11.6% in 2012 to 7.6% in 2023. As we talked about previously, youth unemployment is low. The economy did improve this year. It did grow this year. But life satisfaction for young Koreans is among the lowest in the OECD. So there's definitely a mixed match here. And so I think an increasing number of young people, as we talked about, have opted out of looking for work, and increasing numbers are what you would call irregularly employed. So I think the numbers are deceiving in some way. And maybe we could say, the reality in 2025 is that people maybe are not necessarily poor by traditional definitions, but the declining income surplus that we talked about earlier means that people are feeling like they're in this kind of one step forward, two steps back kind of situation. So you have people's income growing, but this year grew by about 1%, but actual housing costs jumped by nearly 12%. And then you had interest expenses on loans surging by over 23%. So the data might show they're technically earning more, but the cost of living is leaving them behind. So there's clearly these structural economic problems. And of course, the social media aspect, I think that's definitely there. I think focusing on that too much might kind of risk downplaying the real economic concerns that they have. So I think that the social media aspect definitely exacerbates the perceptions they have and makes them feel like they're comparing themselves with their peers and the celebrities. So that's definitely an aspect of it. But there's definitely a real concerns that the young people have now.
Right, so even though the numbers suggest young people are doing better on paper, many still don't feel secure about their future. But 2026 is just around the corner, so let's end on a more forward-looking note. So Taeyong, as we head into the new year, what kind of economic changes do you hope to see for young people?
First of all, I hope to see greater price stability, especially for everyday essentials like food and basic household items. And also on a personal level, I also hope income rise as a parent. And more broadly, I hope we move toward an economy where effort is more reliably rewarded. A society where working hard offers a real sense of financial security, not constant anxiety for young people.
Do you have anything to add?
Yes, so I think in 2026, I would really hope to see somewhat of an educational realignment. So there needs to be a big shift to address the advent of AI and how that's shaping our world, and how all of these entry-level positions like interns and all those positions, like companies are realizing they don't need to hire these people to do those tasks. So I think we need educational realignment to have priorities reorganized and have people prepared to enter amongst this turbulent conditions with this AI-dominated environment. And I do think there also needs to be more serious efforts into, and people have talked about this constantly, I don't want to act like this is a new idea, obviously this is much easier said than done, but I do think there needs to be more efforts to promote regional growth, whether that be promoting investment into regional universities or incentivizing companies to move to other cities like Daejeon or Busan to try to decentralize the opportunities, because I think the only way to fundamentally structurally change the economic system to provide more opportunities for young people is to have Seoul not be the main place where everyone's coming to live. So there needs to be a second city, there needs to be opportunity outside of Seoul. So that's what I would say is the long-term kind of gold standard.
So today's discussion shows that for young people, the economy is no longer just about numbers. It's about security and whether the future feels within reach. And as 2025 comes to a close, the question isn't just about how much young people earn, it's whether young people feel they have a fair chance. So the task ahead is creating an economy that rewards that effort with real opportunities for everyone. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of News Generation. With News Gen, we'll be back tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Korea time with more stories and discussions. Big thanks to Taeyong.
Thank you and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, and also Christopher.
Happy New Year.
And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you have the best day. We are News Generation.